Welcome to RuralStrong, where we talk real challenges and bold solutions in rural economic development. I'm your host, Joe Barker. Let's get into it. This is your host, Joe Barker, and we're coming to you today from the Southwest Tennessee Development District podcast studio in lovely downtown Jackson, Tennessee. And we've got, I'm going to call our guest today an experienced economic developer today. And we have Chris Clifton, who currently is the Chief Executive Director of the Watertown Development Corporation in Watertown, South Dakota. Chris, welcome to RuralStrong.
Thank you. I don't know whether to call you commissioner or representative or mayor.
Just call me Joe. That's the easiest thing. That's right.
Since I've known you in so many different positions, Joe, during my tenure in Tennessee.
Well, you know, Chris, I've really looked forward to this conversation because you have served in various capacities, really all across the nation. As I mentioned, you're in South Dakota now, but you've been in Wyoming and you've been in Kentucky and North Carolina and Arkansas, and we mentioned Tennessee, where you've been in Memphis and Knoxville and Jackson, and I guess my question is, as you look back on your career, is there a difference in how economic development is perceived in different parts of the country, or is it all pretty much the same?
Every deal's got its nuances, Joe. It's still made up of people. And yes, people are different from one place to another, whether it be city or county or state or region. I mean, the deal transactions I was involved with on the private sector side in the Front Range in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and up in Montana when we were doing the medical office development in Kalispell are dramatically different than the deals I did in the Carolinas. But it's just because the people are different. And I think that's the nice part about the business. The industrial real estate business is, every transaction is different. They all got hair on them. Somebody's got to take a haircut, so you're always negotiating. And I like the fact that it's a vast variety from one place to the other.
Tell our listeners, Chris, about Watertown Development Corporation, just exactly what it is and some of the things y'all focus on.
It's a pretty unique public-private partnership. It was formed in 1949 by a couple of dozen business people that threw a couple $100 of each into the pot and said, we want to make the community better. And I think you have to understand that, as a state today, South Dakota has less than 1 million people. So when you think about Watertown back in 1950, it had 3,500, maybe 4,000 people. Sioux Falls, the biggest city at that time, maybe had 40 or 45,000. Today, Sioux Falls is right at 250,000. Watertown is 27,000. The county and the city together are about 32,000. It's been growing at about 2 or 3%, so nothing magnanimous, but this organization has kind of been the do-all, see-all for industrial development from the land development side and including the last 25, 30 years on the building side. So we're a $34 million joint public-private real estate development company. We do build-to-suit, we do building ownership, we do lease-back, we do IDB transactions, we do direct investment and some indirect investment on anything from multifamily, senior living. We're doing some downtown development. We're looking at some senior living space on the south side of town, and then also we're doing single-family development. I would say probably in the 50 unit basis on about 5 acres on the southeast side of town, just because there's a demand for it, and we really aren't big enough to have any developers. We're about 3 hours west of Minneapolis, and 90 miles north of Sioux Falls. So we kind of have to be the development community. And that's one of the things that drew me to this market was I'm doing everything from soup to nuts. I'm doing master planning and buying raw industrial dirt, corn land, farmland, and converting it on paper to what their future development needs are going to be on the industrial side. But I'm also doing commercial development. I own some buildings downtown. The organization does. So I'm a landlord for commercial space as well. Um, so I'm really the developer in the areas that we can't find private development that will fill the need.
And if I'm an investor or just a prospective client, sell me on Watertown, South Dakota. What do you sell folks on to get them to come to your community?
Well, the manufacturing sector makes up about 34% of the workforce. There's a huge set of clusters here, mostly in the OEM side. We have some alphas with Terex Corporation, with Crenlo Cab, with Dakota Cab. So we're doing a lot of OEM products that are on the edges of the traditional tier 2 and tier 3 supplier side for non-traditional transportation that's not over the road trucks, but that are utility vehicles, lift vehicles, boom trucks, everything from fire and life safety vehicles that are all built on chassis and cabs that are built in Watertown. So I would say from a manufacturing standpoint, that makes up the largest cluster of due diligence on manufacturing, and then we have some other providers that are doing ancillary work in the third tier side of OEM for people like John Deere and Caterpillar and others that are in the region, the greater region. So it's workforce. I mean, it's always been workforce. We've got a great tech ed operations here, one of the best in the country in my view, and I've been around the Quick Start program that started in Georgia, back in the late 80s and early 90s, through to the Quick Start program in Tennessee and Arkansas and others. Lake Area Tech here is probably the single largest attractive provider of skill set training, and most of the jobs for a 6-month or a 10-month or a 12-month training program, you're walking out making $25 an hour as a MIG TIG welder in one of the alpha companies that are here within Watertown or within the region. So I would say that's the backbone. And then we have all the other goods and services around that. We have our own hospital system. And then we have Sanford Health here as well too. So it's very, very much a lot like the hub that you see in Jackson, Tennessee, that I was so privileged to be a part of back in the late 80s and early 90s, during the time when I arrived and the unemployment rate was almost 20%, and Jackson had lost about 9 different industries before I came from Georgia back home to Jackson in 84, 85.
Yes, we all remember those days, and hopefully we don't see those days again. Let me ask you this. Working in a public-private partnership, what's your role as you recruit industry in working with local elected officials?
I think it's educational primarily. We're all blessed, in this country with a great participative form of government that allows, the checks and balances in a constitutional republic. And I think that South Dakota, one of our monikers is, freedom works here, and we're really, really a very independent, front range kind of state. And I think that speaks volumes to, hey, we want participation and everybody needs to be involved and everybody has to have skin in the game, but you just don't do it externally. You do it by being, part of the day-to-day operations. I have a board of directors of 30 people. I have a council. I have a county commission, just like everybody else it does in most of the other states. And you try to engage them. And the way that you engage them, I think, is by taking a role as an educator to get them to understand how a deal matures. Joe, we all know that this whole idea of site selection in industrial recruiting or business development is a misnomer. It's really site elimination. You start with 10 or 12 states or 10 or 12 cities or 10 or 12 locations, and you start eliminating those with red flags that pop up. So you're spending a majority of your time trying to stay on the list, so to speak, and be competitive in that regard. And if you don't educate your elected officials on the front end to understand how that deal flow happens and how you stay competitive, then you're just reacting. And I think that's where most communities fail, is they don't spend the time to create straw projects that I've done throughout my career, where we practice on a deal before the deal even happens. I did that recently with a data center because data centers are so popular. They're kind of like the purple squirrel of the industrial recruiting basis this year. And, my community is going to see some. And we said, let's look at what it would take. I mean, how do we change the UDC code? And what about noise and water usage and transportation and traffic and power? And, why wait till the deal shows up at your doorstep and you're given the consultant's report and they say, you got 48 hours to make a decision on whether you're willing to do A, B, C, D, and F, and G to stay in the hunt. So I think it goes back to your question of what role do we play? And I think that we have to play the role of being the subject matter expert with our elected officials that change from time to time, so they understand the complexities of how this business works.
Well, Chris, many of our listeners, of course, are local economic developers. And in your experience, and I know things have changed. I was just thinking as you were talking years ago, we had all these site visits, and now, you don't get a site visit until you're really in the game at the end, because there's so much information for these site selectors that they can cull through and find out more about your community than maybe the community knows about themselves. But what are two or three things that you could tell these local economic developers that are most important, you think, in being able to put their community in the best position?
Well, I think you got to reach out and use the resources that are available to you. And I'll use Jackson, Tennessee, and Madison County as a great example. I was fortunate enough to have worked on and announced 6 different deals with Mike Mullis, with J.M. Mullis Site Selection. Sure. Out of Memphis. And then having moved from Jackson to Memphis after doing those 6 deals, I mean, there were a number of deals that we did with Mike that we lost, that we didn't do, that we weren't selected for. And Mike's just one example. But when I got to Memphis, and, of course, I wasn't involved with developing property because I had Boyles, Bells, IDI, some of the greatest national developers in the country that were building spec space. But I still went back to people like Mike and other people like Cushman and Wakefield and C.B. Richard Ellis and others to say, what about this site or what about that site? One of the success stories for me and my team in Memphis was the development of the Frank Pigeon Industrial Park. I mean, that park was, 2,500 acres that had all the infrastructure except for a slackwater harbor. And until we found Birmingham Steel, which eventually got bought by Nucor Steel and landed the deal to build that slackwater harbor at that park, the park was useless. It had been there for 30 years with all kinds of infrastructure, but has just never been positioned right in the national forward-facing arena to say we've got all the infrastructure for you to do a cold-rolled steel operation. And it's the only one in the state of Tennessee. So I think you use the J.M. Mullises of the world, the brokers around, and even if you're sitting in Savannah, Tennessee, there's no reason why you can't reach out to somebody like Mike or PVA and others that have all these resources available that will help you evaluate. Tennessee's got a great program now that they joint venture with with TVA on that a lot of states really don't have, and that's the whole site development side. 25 years ago, when we talked about site ready, Joe, it's totally different than today. I mean, when a prospect comes to my market, I mean, if I don't have Johnny on the spot, a copy of the phase one, the soil boring report, all the other due diligence that are required on the front end, it's not a shovel-ready site. Um, I'm at the point here in South Dakota where when clients come to us and look at one of the sites that we own, I actually give them a guarantee that if they give me a site plan, I will give them building permit in 72 hours.
Wow. Well, you're
So,
you're you're exactly right. These, you can't sell off an empty shelf, and I'm
no,
always
sir.
amazed when
Oh,
I talk to communities, wherever they might be, and they always talk about a great piece of land, but they have no infrastructure to that property, and they're competing with everybody else, and they're becoming what we call shovel ready. So it's highly important to have that site ready.
believe me, even when I went, when I was in Kentucky, when I started in the business in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, or even you would think a major metro like Augusta, Georgia, I had sites that I would talk to my board members about and say, look, guys, this is a beautiful cornfield, cotton field that's got street lights and a substandard road to it. But I can't put a deal here because I still have a mile to get the sewer here and a quarter mile to get the road improved, and I've got to have Stanton residual pressure to be able to drive an ESFR sprinkler system in the building that'll take 18 months to build. So I got to have a water tank, and by the time you get through all that diatribe, the deal's gone.
Absolutely.
I mean, these deals are like passive least resistance. They're like tornadoes. So if you're not well prepared and truly are shovel ready, because I've seen a lot of sites in my consulting side of my life where I've looked at it and said, look, folks, you can call this shovel ready all day long, but I can't pull a permit on this for until I've had people tell me shovel ready sites and they're not even entitled yet. So, there's. I think you have to be careful in the community in the sense that you want to be as prepared as you can, without going the full mile. I'm not a big proponent of building pads, building buildings. I know we talked about spec buildings in my career for 35 years. You just never can hit the mark on something like that. I think existing buildings are great to market and sell, but they're already fixed. I think what you need to do is make sure that dirt is truly shovel ready and you can pull a permit regardless of which industry comes to you and wants to facilitate their project on your particular site.
Absolutely. Chris, we're a regional economic development organization. We serve 8 counties, 35 cities. In your experience, can you tell us a little bit about maybe a project that was a regional project and how you were able to bring all the players together?
Yeah, I'll use Maytag as a good example since it's local to Jackson. We were gonna be moving probably 25 to 35 families, not all of which were going to come out of Newton, Iowa, where Maytag was coming from. But even on the DeVilbiss project that came to Jackson, we were moving 18 families from DeVilbiss's operations in Toledo that they were going to shuttle. If you don't understand that, that's pretty dynamic when you talk about moving that many families from one location or one part of the country to another. And they're not all going to have a need that they all want to live over at the country club and buy a house or buy a lot and build a house next to the golf course. Even in Augusta, Georgia, when I moved the headquarters for a big appliance company called Roper that was a big supplier at the time to Sears on the appliance side. I moved that from Kankakee, Illinois to Augusta, Georgia. I had to individually meet with all of the families that I was going to be moving from Kankakee, and I had some special needs in there. We had one that was an Olympic swimmer category that was 11 years old. And her family said, look, we're not moving to Augusta until you can show us where we can get in the AAU program to facilitate a child that we have that we think is a prodigy that's going to go on and be an Olympian. So I think that's the kind of regional concept that it takes, because nobody's making a decision on whether they're going to live and work in Jackson or Memphis or Watertown or wherever it may be. They're looking at the region, they're looking at the state, they're looking at all the resources that are available. And I think that's where you pull in all the other connected dots that tie into that, because whether it's Jackson State Community College, Union University, University of, my alma mater at Murray State University, I pulled from when we did deals in Jackson, because people wanted to know where the four-year universities were within 100, 150 miles, that when they made the move from Illinois or Indiana, that they were going to have an opportunity to send their kids to as time went on. So I think it's all those examples are I think true today, and certainly they've been played out very well with the Blue Oval decision. So I can't think of a deal, large or small, that I ever had just a local initiative involved in it. It takes a village.
Chris, you mentioned Blue Oval, and one of the great challenges we're having, particularly in our rural communities, as we try to attract the workforce that is needed at Blue Oval, is available housing. And as I talk to someone from a different part of the country, does South Dakota have any innovative programs that can assist communities in developing housing?
Well, one of the things that we've decided to do, and I think anytime you get an issue like affordable housing, which is certainly an important economic development priority, is you got to look at the resources that you currently have. We had some property that we owned 25 years ago that had never developed. It was kind of in a light industrial mixed use area, and we end up with about 7 acres that we now have hired an architect and an engineer to do some backfill, what we call pocket neighborhoods, where we're looking at designing and building some walk-up townhomes that are priced at $250,000 or less, that are going to give you 1,100 square feet, 2-bedroom, 2-bath, 2-car garage, just because nobody's building in that market. And within a half a mile of that site is one of our alphas, Terex Corporation, which currently has 150 jobs unfilled that they can't find people to go to work for there from the region. And now they're recruiting from Omaha and Kansas City and Minneapolis. And people are coming in saying, hey, where am I going to live? I mean, we have apartments here. And then we have housing being developed at 300,000 and above, but there's nothing on the affordable side. So we're stepping up to say, maybe we put land in the deal. We're going to do all the entitlement, all the design engineering, and we're going to put it out on the street to see if we can get some developers that will bite into this. We're going to put a debt stack together and have some attractive financing in place. We may end up doing some build to suit. We may do some own to rent or rent to own. We've even looked at developers from other parts of the country who've coming in on doing just a rent only private equity product. So, we're in the same boat. Everybody's in the affordable housing business, and we're trying to do what we can with what resources we have. But I'm also looking at and have worked with a couple other key developers outside the upper Midwest. One I'll mention, Next Chapter Neighborhood. If you'll Google Next Chapter Neighborhood, there's a group in Georgia that has an outstanding product lineup. They're just doing a project now in North Augusta, South Carolina. They've done a project in Terre Haute, Indiana, a couple in the Savannah, Georgia metro area. But it's a great product line, and I recommend anybody that is looking at affordable housing to look at companies like that. And there's some great private equity folks that are doing some key things. We're talking to a couple of companies in Omaha that may come up here and look at doing some modular development in that under 200,000 range. So, You got to use the resources you got, and everybody's in the same boat. But to answer your question, the South Dakota Housing Authority does do some low interest construction loan financing at below market, about 4% right now for 60 months. And so we're tapping into that, but it's only going to be a gap financing, and it's only going to be maximum 40% of the project. So we're always leveraging our local banks.
The state of Tennessee recently approved using tax increment financing for housing. Is this available in South Dakota, and have you ever
Yes.
used a TIF to encourage housing?
Yes and yes. In fact, we have 11 TIFs here in Watertown right now that are active. Most of them are commercial, but we have done 3 within the last 3 years that are multifamily. So TIF works well again, coupled with other programs. We we brought the TIF in to handle the public sector infrastructure and the grading and drainage, or in a couple of cases, we had buildings that had to be demolished. So you were doing backfill urban renewal. But we also coupled those with USDA and some of the other programs, including EDA, on finding debt stack that would include the TIF program as well. TIF in and of itself doesn't cover the whole deal. Because sometimes it's hard to get a TIF approved if you're looking at loading up the TIF with a lot of the amenities that maybe you want in the development. But it's a great tool, and yeah, it's used all over the state of South Dakota. It's a great tool. I used it in Georgia, and I think you're going to see more of it being used in places like Memphis, Tennessee. So I think it's an up and coming tool for the state of Tennessee.
Our guest today is Chris Clifton, who is one of the most recognized names in the country in economic development. And in the couple of minutes we've got left, Chris, what do you see as some of the greatest challenges moving forward for economic development professionals?
I still believe that as a profession, we fail to mentor the way we should. I was on the board of directors of AEDC before it was dissolved and merged in with IEDC. I've been very pleased in my career that I had some great people that were ahead of me in the career that took me under their wing. But I don't think we do enough of that to the point where we think about how we can bring the local initiatives together and take somebody like Kyle Spurgeon and use his experience to help train and educate and coach some of the other younger people that are in the industry. I mean, Kyle was in Paris, Tennessee when I hired him as my number 2. And, I think it takes that kind of initiative. Fortunately, I've had a lot of people in my career that have worked for me or I've hired that have now gone on to run their own organizations. And I think if more of us in the profession would take that kind of approach, then I think we'd have a better product in the end. And a lot of it is hard because I know what it was like when I first came to Jackson. I'd said something about let's get somebody from Middle Tennessee, and they go, "Oh no, we don't want to have anybody from Middle Tennessee. We played them in football in 1965, and they beat us in the state champion, and we just want to be better than them." So I know we have our own biases about place and market, but I think if we think outside that box of competitiveness and say, how do we make Tennessee better by mentoring our peers around us first and foremost, as opposed to those in other states and other regions, we might do better. And then I think the other side of it is transparency. I've seen so many programs that talk about, well, we have to keep everything confidential. Well, we all put code names on projects. So why can't you go to the media and talk about?
Hey, where do they come up with these code names anyway?
It's funny. Well, when I first came to Memphis, they were using numbers, and I said, look, it's always better. The media really buys into when you start calling, the Project Banana or Project
Zebra.
Project Zebra, yeah, whatever. And so I just left it up to my staff, and we started doing that in Memphis, and the Business Journal just loved it. They had a whole category of various names, and we would just pick stuff out. I remember through the fence operations I did with my team in Memphis with UPS, we called it The Other Company. That was the name of the prospect, The Other Company, because they were the biggest competitor to FedEx. And I knew I was going to have to go see Fred one day and get his permission to chase a deal with UPS. They were looking at putting an $80 million facility they eventually built at the runway next to the hub in Memphis. But yeah, I think that's just the fun exercise. But I think it helps. It helps John Q. Public and the elected and appointed officials, as well as people understand you're not going to go to church or go to Walmart on a weekend and talk about Project 1, 2, 3. You're going to say, "Hey, have you heard we're in the hunt for Project Dynamic?" And West Tennessee Industrial Association, the state of, and these people are spending resources on pursuit costs to try to make this deal happen. When I hear that, when I'm standing in line at Walmart on a weekend, I get excited. I mean, I like to hear things like that.
Absolutely. Wow, what a pleasure it's been, and all too brief a conversation today with Chris Clifton from Watertown, South Dakota, and we all can learn from the experience of people like Chris. And Chris, when you come back to West Tennessee now, be sure and give me a shout, and I'd love to get together with you.
Do that, Joe. I thank you very much, and just I want everybody to know we got birds to slay here in South Dakota. So y'all get in your vehicle. I know it's not Sturgis weekend, but you can come and help us slay some of these birds, because we have to deal with them all winter long if you don't kill them.
Thank you, Chris, and all the best to you, my friend.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for joining us on Rural Strong. If you found this helpful, share it, and follow the show for more insights from rural leaders making a real difference. Until next time, stay rural strong.